Is the original Final Fantasy VII in 2024 worth playing? Undoubtedly, yes. Before this video, I've never played the original Final Fantasy VII for a multitude of reasons that I'll explain throughout the video. However, this year I was determined to play the original Final Fantasy VII to see what all the hype and the praise that surrounded this game was all about, along with potentially getting more out of Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And I'm so glad that I gave the original Final Fantasy VII a shot, because honestly, this might be my new favorite Final Fantasy game. However, the original Final Fantasy VII is definitely not perfect, and there are a few things about the game and sections of the game that I've found particularly annoying. So let's talk about the greatness of the original Final Fantasy VII and where it falls short, along with what it was like to play the original Final Fantasy VII for the first time here in 2024. Why now? So why now? Why is it taking me this long to play the original Final Fantasy VII? I would consider myself a pretty strong Final Fantasy fan, and I know that this is hailed as one of the best Final Fantasy titles, if not the best Final Fantasy title. So why haven't I played it prior to this video, and why did I decide to play it now? Plain and simple, the reason I picked up this game is simply because of Rebirth. Everything that I've seen about that game looks incredible, it reviewed very well, and fans love it. And because I want to play that game, I decided to pick up this game and play through it to get a better appreciation for that game, whenever I get around to it. But that's also not the full story either, so let me elaborate a little bit further. I never played the original Final Fantasy VII back when it released in 1997 because I simply was just too young for it. I wouldn't have been able to progress through the game or appreciate it either. However, years later, I did play the original Final Fantasy X as it was released for PlayStation 2, and that game instantly hooked me and started my journey as a Final Fantasy fan. And of course, through this, the rhetoric around Final Fantasy as a whole, that Final Fantasy X was a great Final Fantasy game, but Final Fantasy VII was the best Final Fantasy. Yet, I still didn't even try to pick up Final Fantasy VII at this time. However, in 2015, I did buy Final Fantasy VII for both iOS and PlayStation 4, and even later I bought Final Fantasy VII on Steam during a Square Enix sale. I still haven't touched the Steam version of it, but I did try Final Fantasy VII on iOS and PlayStation 4 when I bought it. I quickly found out games on iOS are not enjoyable for me, so I almost instantly put that one down. But I did give the PS4 version a fair shot, but ultimately I put it down a few hours into the game and never picked it back up. Until now, that is. For me, the primary reason why I never tried to play this game was the visual design and the game design as a whole. At the time, I found this game to be very visually unappealing and kind of cumbersome to play, and I kind of wrote the game off after this, especially when Final Fantasy VII Remake came out. When FF7 Remake was announced, I was very excited because I knew that this was one of the best Final Fantasy games and that they were remaking it, so this seemed like the ideal way for me to hop into Final Fantasy VII. So I got Final Fantasy VII Remake when it launched, and I played it for a couple hours, but then I ultimately put it down and never picked it back up. FF7 Remake looked gorgeous, and it played pretty well too, even in that first couple hours that I played it. But I couldn't get into the story at all. Everything felt fairly cheesy and just made absolutely no sense to me, so I put the game down. However, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth made me rethink my past decisions on the franchise. Rebirth is being hailed as one of the best, if not the best, Final Fantasy title to date, and is pretty much at #1 for potential candidates of Game of the Year at this point. So obviously I want to play it, but I really should play Remake before Rebirth. So of course I started looking around on the internet on why I was wrong for not falling in love with Remake, and the singular answer that I kept coming across in various different ways and various different outlets was that I didn't appreciate Remake because I hadn't played the original Final Fantasy VII. So at this point, it was clear what I needed to do, and that was to open my mind more to the misshapen polygon misfits of Avalanche and play and finish the original Final Fantasy VII, and I'm so glad I did. I came into this game with really low expectations, and I left bewildered by how good the game actually was. There's so many aspects of the original Final Fantasy VII that are just really great that I'll definitely hit on throughout the video, but I think it's only proper to start the discussion with where the game starts you, and arguably one of the best aspects of Final Fantasy VII. Intro, plot, and lore. So the game starts you off with a panoramic shot of the main metropolitan area of the world of Final Fantasy VII, which is Midgar. It's a pretty extensive look at the city, and really does a good job of showing you how involved and complex the city actually is, along with setting the tone. From here, we move to the main character and the main party member, Cloud. Cloud's joining up with another party member, Barrett, in the middle of Midgar. They're there to carry out a mission which involves destroying one of the reactors in the city that is essentially sucking up all of the life force of the planet called Mako. Barrett's part of a rebel group called Avalanche, and Cloud is a merc for hire. From the very beginning, Cloud makes it known that he's only there for a paycheck, and Barrett makes it known that he's here because he believes that stopping Shinra, which is essentially the corporation responsible for creating the reactors, and they're doing this for monetary gain, will save the planet. From the jump, these two are at odds with one another, and the rest of the team that's with you at this time has to struggle to keep the peace between the two so that the mission goes as planned. From here, the team journeys to the reactor, blows it up, fights several Shinra troops, and eventually makes it back to the headquarters. However, blowing up the reactor wasn't as smooth as the team would have hoped, and there was a lot of collateral damage. This is shown pretty expertly as Cloud gets separated from the group and has to make his way back to the train which leads to their headquarters. While on his journey to the train, he has to go through the chaos of the aftermath of the reactor being destroyed. As the team gets back to the headquarters in the 7th sector, they begin discussing how bad the aftermath was, and they start to question whether this was the right thing to do or not, which inevitably leads the player to question if this group really is the good guys or not. This intro sequence is honestly wonderful and one of the best intros in all of video games, to be honest, and I'm skipping over a lot here, but this beginning section really does a good job at setting up the characters, the world, and the themes of the game. There's immediately a lot of personality in these characters, the world seems very dense with history and lore, and the conflict of the game and between the characters, along with the inner conflict of the characters, is just excellent. But speaking of lore, if you're not familiar with Final Fantasy VII, in the last few minutes that I've been talking, I've been just basically spouting out a lot of terms that probably don't make a whole lot of sense. And that's because the lore of this world is really deep and complicated. And honestly, it's pretty interesting too. So here's my stab at it. The planet itself has energy that creates life and nurtures it, which is called Mako energy. This energy is necessary for the planet to go on, or so it's believed. And Shinra, the aforementioned corporation that's responsible for creating the reactors that's taking all the Mako out of the planet, is using that to create energy to make money. The energy can be used in various different technologies, not only to power certain cities, but also to construct them as well, such like Midgar. Thus the reason for the 8 different reactors in Midgar existing. As for Midgar itself, it's the primary major metropolitan city of the world of Final Fantasy VII, and it's really the only one that's like it. There's 2 different levels to Midgar, and there's 8 different sectors with a central hub area. The 2 levels are the upper plates and the lower slums. Shinra essentially owns Midgar, so only people that work for Shinra or that are loyal to Shinra can live in the upper plate, which is much more luxurious than the lower slums. Anyone that doesn't work for Shinra or goes against Shinra is confined to the lower slums, which is where the headquarters is at in the 7th sector. The group Avalanche, the group that Barrett, Cloud, and some of the other starting party members are a part of, and that's also responsible for blowing up the 8th reactor, is considered a rebel group by most people in the slums, as these people see that extracting Mako is a really bad thing for the planet, and it's essentially killing the planet, but the people loyal to Shinra see the group Avalanche as a terrorist group. Thus far, this is the main points of what's important for this section of the story, but later on the plot really thickens, and the lore gets deeper and deeper, and it's just very impressive, which I'll absolutely hop into in the spoiler section, but for now, let's stick to this. Visuals, presentation, and soundtrack. So again, I have a history of not particularly being a fan of the visuals or the presentation of this game. I've always disliked the polygon characters and the still backgrounds with low frame rates. However, I'll tell you why my opinion was wrong. Everything else around this title is so good that the visuals and the presentation quickly fade into obscurity. It's just the initial hill that you have to get over in order to see the greatness of the plot, the characterization, and the battle system, all of which I'll hit on throughout this video. The visuals as a whole are definitely not up to snuff for this day and age. However, it's not like it's particularly bad either once you get used to it. It's just very initially off-putting. There's very few games that share this art style, and there's a reason for that. It naturally looks older by design. Not during the time of the original release, but looking back on it now, absolutely. But again, it's more of a specific art design that's somewhat unique to this game. So when you see polygon characters, you immediately think Final Fantasy VII. So in that case, I don't think that it's necessarily bad graphics or anything like that. I mean, obviously some of the graphics and the cutscenes aren't up to today's levels, but I feel like what I'm having a problem with, and honestly probably a lot of people are having a problem with, is the art design. And I mean, yeah, initially the art design seems poor. However, what actually won me over with the art design was actually a lot of the art design around the enemies and the summons. I initially was judging this game based off a lot of early game world design and character design, which again, I found to be pretty average and not that attractive. However, some of the enemy designs just outside of the first couple hours of the game are tremendous, along with all of the summons. And later on in the game, when you get the opportunity to visit other areas, I found that the world design was actually a lot more diverse and interesting than I initially thought. After a few hours of playing this game, I really started to get into the art design, and now having finished the game, I look back on the visuals pretty fondly. There's obviously a lot of limitations with the graphics, and there's some weird animations due to the age of the game, but overall, it does very much hold up well today, I think. You just have to let yourself get over that initial hump of the abrasiveness of the art design and some of the dated graphics and animations. The music, however, is still top tier. I undoubtedly believe that some of the best tracks in the entire series are here in this OST. Each track is great, and honestly, the set of tracks is pretty diverse, which is always a plus. Yet, I would still put other Final Fantasy OSTs over this one, in particular Final Fantasy 13s and Final Fantasy 10s. But again, here in Final Fantasy 7, there are some of the best tracks in the entire series. So Final Fantasy 7 still has a phenomenal soundtrack. The battle system and gameplay. Throughout this channel's history, I've claimed that Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy X, and even Final Fantasy X-2 have magnificent battle systems, and they're some of the best battle systems in the franchise, and I still stand wholeheartedly behind those statements. But Final Fantasy VII's battle system stands right up there with all those titles. This battle system is spectacular with a ton of depth and is extremely fun to play. But there are some caveats. Essentially here in Final Fantasy VII, you have the classic ATB turn-based battle system, with random enemy encounters where each character and enemy gets a turn to perform a command after a specific ATB gauge fills. For this iteration of the ATB system, I think the ATB gauge is balanced pretty well. It's not really too long, but it's also not too short, so you do get time to grasp what's going on at any point in time throughout the battle, and to find the specific commands that you need without running out of time so that the enemy gets another opportunity to attack you. And when major cinematic animations are going on, there's also a wait mode, which gives you even more time to make decisions. But one of my main issues with the system is that you can't swap party members during battle. So the way that it works is you basically pick 3 party members out of a total of 9 possible party members. And those are the characters that you make your journey with, along with the characters that you fight with. So of course most people, including me, will naturally pick their favorite 3 characters, or quote unquote the 3 best characters, and only play with them. So again, there's 9 different party members. So if you do that, 6 of the party members hardly ever get used. And that was my case. Which is a shame because I feel like all the party members are fun to play with and they're just really cool characters in general, but basically you're only really dealing with 3 of them. And the real drawback here is not just only being able to battle with 3 party members, it's having the story involved with primarily only 3 party members. Meaning that during certain moments in the story or various side quests, you lose out of a lot of potential dialogue. Even some of the side quests can be obtained because you don't have certain members in your party at the right time. However, this does incentivize you to do multiple playthroughs, I guess, which is always a good thing, but still. Another main aspect of the battle system are the actual commands that you'll be doing during battle, which can be a plethora of different moves. The standard commands that everybody has is attack, defend, and use items. However, the library of other possible commands are directly linked with the materia system, which is arguably the most defining aspect of this combat system, if not the original Final Fantasy VII as a whole. And thankfully, it's a magnificent addition to the battle system and really to the game overall. Materia works by giving the character a specific attack move, a summon, boost in stats, or a magical attack that is provided by that specific materia that's equipped either a character's weapon or armor piece. Through usage, the vast majority of materia can be evolved to basically become more powerful versions of its previous self. The most simplistic example of this are the magic materials. So when you equip a fire materia and you use that fire materia or just defeat enemies while having that equipped, you gain AP points which level up the materia. So when you initially equip the fire materia, you have access to the move fire, but when you level it up to level 2, you gain access to another move which is fire 2. Now each of these moves costs MP, which is basically your magic points. Of course the initial fire is going to be less and the second fire is going to be more, but the second fire is also more powerful. And for the most part, it's a pretty linear upgrade with certain exceptions. An example would be something like the Restore materia, which houses the Cure spell. When the Restore materia reaches level 3, instead of requiring Cure 3, you get Regen, which basically just stimulates a small amount of healing for a character consistently instead of all at once. So it's still in the same category per se, but not directly linear. Along with this, with summons, it also works a little bit differently. Each time a summon is leveled up, you don't get a more powerful summon, rather you get the opportunity to use that summon again within the same battle. So for example, when you initially get Bahamut, you can only summon him once in a singular battle, but when you level him up to level 4, you can summon him 4 times in a singular battle. The materia in the original Final Fantasy VII is a super cool system, but what's even better than the materia alone is actually how it works in tandem with the armor and weapon system. As mentioned prior, materia is equipped either a weapon or armor piece, and each party member can have one of both equipped at a time. But each specific weapon and armor piece has a limited amount of slots that these materia can be equipped to. And there's 2 different types of slots, that being the linked slots and the unlinked slots. Linked slots are required for some materia to even work. For instance, the all materia. The all materia only works when another materia is linked to it, and what it essentially does is it applies it to either all party members or all enemies. So for example, when the fire materia is linked to all, the fire spell will hit all the enemies, but when the all materia is linked to cure, when you cast cure, all party members in battle will be healed. But the trade-off for this is that it decreases by 1/3 of its original strength for both the fire and the cure spell, therefore kind of striking the balance within the system. However, for most armor pieces and weapons, they're probably going to have unlinked slots, but there's a bit of a balance to this as well. So some pieces will have a lot of slots on them while others don't, and the balance here is that pieces that have a ton of slots on them have a major drawback in that they have a very low attack power or attack percentage or defense percentage with weapons and armor respectively. But typically the weapons and armor that have very few slots have a much higher attack or have a multiplier for AP application to level up the materia quicker. Because of how all this works together, there's a really fine balancing system here that incentivizes you to equip the right armor, the right weapons, and the right materia for your playstyle and your goals, which throughout the game is probably going to be ever changing, so you'll probably have to constantly switch it up, especially because this game can get difficult. There are absolutely difficult sections in this game where you probably will die the first time you come around if you haven't played the game before, and if you haven't been grinding levels or materia prior to this, especially with the bosses, which I love this whole design. And the difficulty here isn't just the simplistic approach of a boss or an enemy having a ton of health and you're essentially just under leveled for the first time when you encounter it. Don't get me wrong, this absolutely happens as well, but there's a ton of enemies that require a certain approach to engagement because they have very unique moves or they behave strangely in battle. And honestly, there's a pretty good variety here, and that's just awesome for the battle system. But by far, my two favorite things about the battle system are the limit breaks and the summons, with the summons being my number one thing about this battle system by a long shot. But let's start with the limit breaks. So the limit breaks are essentially just super cool attacks that do a ton of damage and have a cinematic animation behind it, and pretty much all of them for every party member is super cool. And speaking of the party members, each party member also has very specific limit breaks, and they have a healthy number of them as well. You initially only start off with 1 or 2, but as you play the game and level up and just kind of continue through your journey, you'll acquire more. And the newer limit breaks are basically just better limit breaks than the previous ones. You obtain a limit break by doing various different things throughout battle, like executing commands, defeating enemies, taking damage, and just letting turns pass by. But once the limit break meter hits full, the normal attack command becomes the limit break command, and thus you can activate the limit break and release it at this point. And again, these do a ton of damage, they look really cool, and honestly the meter fills up pretty quick too with pretty much everybody, and they carry over from one battle to the next. The limit breaks add a lot of variety to the battle system, and they're a super cool addition to the system as a whole. However, the summons are where it's at for me. I think the original Final Fantasy VII has one of the best implementations of the summon system in the franchise, maybe the best. The only other Final Fantasy title that might give this system a run for its money is Final Fantasy X's Aeons. But anyways, here in the original Final Fantasy VII, summons work through materia. So you first have to equip the summon to the character that you want to have the ability to summon it, and then for a cost of MP, you can summon the summon. Once you summon them, they'll do a massive attack that does a lot of damage to either one or all of the enemies. And some summons are weaker than others and they'll only cost a little bit of MP, but most of the summons are going to be relatively useful, especially some of the late game summons, and they cost a lot of MP and are much more powerful. Along with this, each summon also has a unique ability or aspect about them that makes them very useful in certain situations, or very detrimental too. For example, Ifrit is an early game summon that is very good when you initially get him, but he does do fire damage. So for some enemies that are weak to fire damage, this is a really good choice. But for enemies that absorb fire damage, this is a really bad choice. However, Bahamut, which is a mid to late game summon, is pretty useful throughout the entire game because his unique ability is to ignore all the enemy's defense stats. So even if an enemy has a very high defense stat, Bahamut's attacks goes right through it and the enemy's stats is essentially 0. But the drawback to this is that he costs more than twice the MP that Ifrit does, and he's significantly harder to level up in order to acquire more uses for him in a singular battle. In total, there are 16 summons. 16. And each one of them is significantly different. It's not like you have the weak fire summon Ifrit, and then a strong fire summon, and then a stronger fire summon. No, each one of these is different. And they all have a really awesome cutscene / animation in their own specific use. And on top of all of this, the character that you attach the summon to affects how well the summon performs, meaning that the attack power is based off of the character's own stats. So there's even a metagame here where equipping the appropriate summon to the right characters based off of what you want from that summon makes that summon better or worse. Truly unbelievable stuff here. I absolutely did a summon heavy playthrough with my favorite summons equipped at all times, and I always had armor and weapons. I leveled up these summons to either twice the normal growth rate or triple the normal growth rate, and I had an absolute blast with this. Besides the battle system and the materia system, I would say the next two aspects of Final Fantasy VII that are somewhat of its defining features are the open world and minigames. And I really like the open world a lot. Honestly, it's pretty large and has a wide variety of different areas, which is nice, and there's different modes of traversal, which is always fun. Again, like other aspects of this game, it doesn't look great initially, but there is some charm to the overall style. However, the mini-games are a real hit and miss, and most are misses with me. There's a ton of mini-games in the original Final Fantasy VII, and I can't think of one that I really liked besides the motorcycle one, which I know a lot of people don't like, so that's somewhat controversial. However, the vast majority of mini-games are pretty significantly different, and they do break up the pacing, so that's kind of a good thing, I think. But still, none of them really grabbed me that well, but they were an interesting addition, for sure. Also, I hear heard one of the main complaints about Rebirth are all the minigames, so hoping that's not true. Also, there are some other things that I found particularly annoying with the gameplay, specifically around traversal in dedicated levels. So many times it was difficult to tell where I needed to go and what I could traverse within a level, and there were a lot of times where I'd be either going up or down a path and I didn't know how to go forward to the next section, and usually the answer was just try everything, move forward, move backwards, side to side, up and down throughout the entire path, and eventually I'd find an area where Cloud was either supposed to jump up or down or over to a different section or go on a hidden path or something like that. It was really confusing too much of the time. Along with this, some of the things that you need to do to progress a quest or something like that can also be very elusive and annoying. There was a decent amount of times where I just couldn't figure out how to progress a quest, and all I really needed to do was interact with one random thing on the ground or object or talk to some town folks, and then that would progress to the next step. Some really non-intuitive ones too, like you talk to one person once, run through their entire dialogue, progress the quest a little bit, get locked up, then have to go back to the same person, and now they had new dialogue. There was no kind of like indication of that being a thing. So I eventually just kind of got tired of this, and anytime I got stuck, I just looked up a guide, and this significantly increased my enjoyment of the game. But speaking of enjoyment, let's talk about another section of this game that I really enjoyed. The party members, villains, and side characters. Another major aspect of the original Final Fantasy VII are the party members in regards to the story and the battle system. So I'll go through each one of them and tackle both aspects for each character. So let's start off with the main character, Cloud. Cloud not only is the main character of the original Final Fantasy VII, but he's also the best in battle by a long shot. He's essentially an all-rounder. He has really good magic, has high MP, and has pretty good health as well. And he's also kind of quick, and he has some phenomenal limit breaks. I also really like his design. I mean, at this point it's iconic, but it's iconic for a reason. He really reflects his character as kind of a scrappy individual with a lot of the armor pieces that don't make a whole lot of sense, and the very oversized sword that he carries. In general, he just looks damaged to an extent. But I think this suits him really well, and his design as a whole is just really cool. From a story perspective, I think Cloud is a wonderful main character. Absolutely one of the best Final Fantasy main characters, hands down. There's so much growth and character development that Cloud goes throughout the story, and his character also plays into one of the main themes of the game, which is identity. If you know, you know. We'll hop into it a little bit later in the spoiler section, so don't worry about that. He's an outstanding addition to the title. The second character that's introduced in the game is of course Barret, who is also an excellent character. Battle-wise, he's essentially a second Cloud, but he's not as good overall. However, he does excel at enemies that are weak to projectiles, and potentially to enemies that are far away if he has a projectile weapon attached. Like Cloud, the design of Barret I think is great, and it's even more over the top than Cloud's is. Barret of course has the iconic gun arm for his right arm, and his outfit is pretty rough and tattered up, which reflects his character overall, and how kind of tore up he is as a character, based off the events that this character's had to go through prior to the events of the game. And he's really physically huge as well. It's kind of the tough, testosterone-fueled giant. Barret also has a lot of development throughout the story, but it's a little bit different than what Cloud's is. His theme isn't so much about dealing with identity, but more so about dealing with his trauma. He has some really big moments in the story that do nothing but enhance the story overall, and I think he's an excellent character. Tifa is best girl hands down. She is the right choice. Aerith's great too, like honestly, but you know, I like Tifa better. But anyway, battle-wise, she's a bit underwhelming when you compare her to other characters. She's not bad by any means, but Cloud and Barret definitely do what she does basically, but just significantly better. And again, like the other two before her, I really like her design. It's absolutely more sporty / active gear, which is kind of cool, which plays into her fighting style, which is basically just her punching enemies until they collapse. And story-wise, I think she's also magnificent. She has a huge role in the overall plot, along with a lot of the side stories, and I love her relationship with the rest of the cast, especially Cloud. I also really like the Aerith versus Tifa struggle. I think what they do here in this game with their struggle over Cloud and who's going to end up with Cloud is just done really well overall, and they make it fun. It could have been really messy and overdone, but it's really fun and kind of wholesome. But speaking of Aerith, Aerith is a standout character throughout the story. But combat-wise, she's really weak compared to the others, even more so than Tifa. She absolutely works best as a dedicated healer, which kind of also works really well thematically with how she's portrayed in the story. But most other characters are always a better choice, combat-wise. And surprise, I also really like Aerith's design too. I think that her design fits her character extremely well, with her outfit being very modest and almost innocent in a way, and Tifa's to an extent kind of being the opposite of that, thus fueling the distinction between the Aerith versus Tifa debate. Just really cool stuff. Aerith also has massive implications for the story overall. And probably everyone knows it at this point because it's probably the most spoiled section of any video game ever. And I'll definitely talk more about that in the spoiler section, but here we won't get into it. But overall, I really love her character throughout the story, and I think they nailed it with her. So now on to Red 13. For me, Red 13 is probably the coolest and most unique underrated character in Final Fantasy VII, in the original Final Fantasy VII anyway, and in battle he's really pretty powerful, and honestly he might be the third best option behind Cloud and Barret. But I'm part of the problem because personally I hardly ever used him. In my playthrough I just kind of found other characters would be more compelling in terms of their stories and how they played in battle, so I pretty much always picked them over Red 13. But design wise I really like him. He's essentially a fire dog that's kind of been physically traumatized, like damaged per se, which also kind of gives him the unique appearance of being tough. And with him being a fire dog and most of the other characters being humans, his design and character as a whole is just vastly different from everybody else, which I think is a great contrast to all the other party members and adds a lot of diversity to the team. Story wise, there's absolutely some interesting plot points that revolve around him, and his backstory is very interesting, but he's not really super impactful to the story overall. He's one of the characters that's definitely undermined when you compare it to the main 4 characters, that being Cloud, Barret, Aerith, and Tifa, but I do really like him and I think he's a super cool character. But possibly the coolest character out of everybody is of course Vincent. I mean, there's a whole spin-off game that's dedicated to him, but here he's one of 2 optional characters and he's absolutely treated that way throughout the entire story. Red 13 is probably the most underrated character, but Vincent is definitely the most mysterious and elusive character. He's not really underrated because everybody loves him, but if you don't dig around pretty hard, you just won't find his backstory. In fact, just to get him is somewhat difficult when you compare it to the other optional character. Gameplay wise, Vincent is kind of weird. He does a little bit of everything pretty well, but he's not particularly great at any one thing, especially when you compare him to other characters. But he does have some unique quirks to him, like his limit break, where he can shapeshift, but that's not really the best option for the best team. But it could be fun. Design wise, of course, this guy looks super cool. He's a vampire, and for his design, he's exactly what I would imagine like an anime vampire to be. So super cool party member. Really great design. Again, his story and background are super interesting, which I won't get into here, but again, something to note is that you have to dig pretty hard to find it. It's worth it though. But in my playthrough, he was really underutilized. And honestly, I forgot he was part of my team a couple times throughout the story. There were a few times when cinematics or just story sections would play and then Vincent pops up out of nowhere and the team acknowledges him. And I have a, oh yeah, he's here moment. But again, I really like him and I think he's super cool. And honestly, I kind of want to do another playthrough again with him being a permanent member of my team. And honestly, along with him, probably Red 13 as well. But speaking of permanent members on my team, the second optional character is Yuffie. And I loved her. I thought she was great. She's essentially a kid or a young adult, a young 20s, I think. She's really goofy and just kind of parties along and is a bit rebellious. She brings a lot of levity to the party as a whole, which I really like. And she steals a bunch of stuff, even your party stuff sometimes too. So there's that. For battles, I think she's top tier, which is also a huge reason why she was a permanent member of my party. I think she's almost as good as Cloud and possibly better than Barret with her strength, magic, defense, and limit breaks. And she's also a bit faster too, which is nice. So to me, she was an easy pick to be a permanent member of my team. Do you want to take a guess what I think about her design? Again, it's wonderful, but something to note with Yuffie in particular is how different her design is comparatively, but how well it fits in with the rest of the group in the world of Final Fantasy VII. So something about Final Fantasy VII's character design, in general terms, is that all of the characters seem to fit in really well with the world, and they all look significantly different from one another. But Yuffie stands out among the rest. Barret, Tifa, Aerith, and Cloud all seem to be based off of some type of Western designed outfit, with of course a spark of anime flair to them. Yuffie, however, seems to be based off an Eastern design, again with the same type of anime flair to it, which makes sense because that's the type of area that she comes from. But it's really cool how different she is and how seamlessly she fits into the group and the world as a whole. I don't really like it when characters have very similar designs, but I also don't like it when characters are too different and they feel like they don't belong within the game. No Christ, Final Fantasy 13 too. He should be in Kingdom Hearts. Somewhat like Vincent, Yuffie's backstory is tucked away a little bit, but it's much more easily found, and you can very easily accidentally run into it, which in fact, that's what happened to me. And in general, I think it's more developed in the sense that there's actually a pretty big side quest that leads to Yuffie's backstory, which also significantly further develops her character. Along with this, it also offers some optional in-game choices that won't appear if you don't complete the side quest. So between the 2 optional characters, I think Yuffie definitely gets more development attention, and I'm okay with it because I really like her. Alright, 2 more party members to go. So up next, let's talk about Cait Sith. So this is a really interesting character, and probably one of everybody's least favorite as well. Battle-wise, he's very unique with a lot of quirky limit breaks and some things that are strange that may have advantages at times and then disadvantages at other times. But overall, I feel like he's pretty underwhelming in comparison to some of the other good characters. I still really like him though, especially in the story bits, but for battles, I never used him. His design is also super interesting. He's a cat on top of a Michelin man's offspring or something like that. But basically the cat that's on top is the one that's in control, and the blob underneath him is just the powerhouse. Honestly, this is a very different and cool design, and somehow I think it fits pretty well into the world. Story-wise, he's actually pretty involved, and I think they implemented him in a really neat way. I'll absolutely go into it in the spoiler section, but for now, let's just keep it at that. But overall, I really liked him, and I think he's a great party member, but he just doesn't really stand out amongst the rest. And for the final party member, we have Cid. Cid, of course, is the standard old old grumpy father figure that has his own little obsession and is just kind of grumpy the whole time. But of course he has a soft heart, just like Barrett does. Design wise, he looks like what you'd expect from a character like this. To me, he's probably the least interesting in terms of design, but I mean, it fits his character alright. For battles, he's pretty solid too. He has a really strong attack, great limit breaks, and he does okay with magic, and he has pretty good defense and speed overall. So for my team, I initially played as Cloud, Barrett, and Yuffie. And then I put Tifa in my team for a bit, which I'll talk more about in the story section, which is also the spoiler section. And then I finally switched out Tifa for Sid at the end because I thought he was really fun, I thought he performed really well, and most importantly, he had a triple growth weapon on him. So I used that to really power level some of the materia. Sid does have a decent amount of involvement within the story, especially towards the latter half and the last third of the game, and I think they do a really good job with him. And of course, like a lot of characters, he develops throughout the journey, and he does have a lot of growth to his character, but to me, he's not necessarily a standout like the main four are. And Yuffie, I really like her, but he is good. He's very solid. Honestly, all of the party members are very good, and I could see any one of them being someone's favorite. The party members of the original Final Fantasy VII are iconic for a reason, and that's because they're great, just like the main villain. There's nothing I can say that hasn't already been said about Sephiroth, but I'll certainly try. He's a phenomenal villain throughout the entire playthrough of the original Final Fantasy VII. He's very complex, he vastly contrasts the main character Cloud. He's always menacing, he's clever, and he's a constant threat. He always stands on business. Sephiroth's design, I think, perfectly reflects his character, and of course, is just magnificent. Again, the biggest thing to note here is the contrast between him and Cloud, with Cloud's design being more rough and unorthodox, with that singular shoulder piece and the singular gauntlet, and the kind of rougher clothes, with the oversized sword, the baggy pants, and cut off turtleneck. However, Sephiroth's design is almost ethereal, while also being menacing. To Cloud's one tatted shoulder piece, Sephiroth has two identical pieces that look very well designed. To Cloud's turtleneck sleeveless shirt and baggy pants, Sephiroth has a long pristine trench coat with an undershirt and well-fitted pants. To the massive Buster Sword that Cloud so iconically yields, Sephiroth has a very long, thin samurai sword that's contrasting Cloud's abrasiveness with the Buster Sword with the deadly precision of the elongated samurai sword. Excellent design for Sephiroth. And of course, because he's the main villain, he obviously has a lot of involvement with the story, and I think he's done very well here. I love the twists and turns that he takes the team through and how horrifying he is at times. Again, I think he's done super well here and is by far one of the best villains in Final Fantasy, if not the best. There's also a ton of side characters that are truly fleshed out, and this adds a lot to the game. There's a handful of other villains that you have to deal with throughout the story, and there's side characters too that are very important, especially with their relationships towards some of the party members, and they have somewhat of a major part within the story. Or there's some characters that do a really good job at fleshing out the lore or the background of another character. And there's a ton of towns with a pretty wide variety of different people giving you information about what's going on and what's due next, and etc. There's also different cultures throughout the world, and there's just a ton of stuff in this game when it comes to the world itself and what you can do in it, and I love it. The story. Spoilers. Okay, now we're into spoiler territory. Probably a lot of people have already played this game or know the story pretty well through the gaming culture in general, but if you don't somehow know it, and you do plan on playing it, click off the video now or skip to the timestamp above, that way you're not spoiled on anything. And honestly, if you haven't seen the spoiler that I mentioned prior, then kudos to you, that's very impressive. Alright, so coming into this game, I knew that Aerith dies. It's the worst kept secret in all of gaming at this point. And on top of that, I also knew something was going on with Cloud, where he was like a clone or something like that. But I didn't know or expect a lot of the twists that did happen, or a lot of the bombastic events that happened throughout the story, and I'm very impressed. The Cloud twist was foreshadowed pretty heavily even from the beginning, so even if I wouldn't have known something prior to this, I think I kind of would have figured it out. But for Aerith, even knowing that Sephiroth is going to kill her at some point, when it happened, I still really felt it hard. Like there seemed to be almost no lead up to it. It just kind of came out of nowhere. And even though the game has these polygon characters with some really low res backgrounds and absolutely no voice acting and minimal animations, I still really felt the Aerith death hard. It was such a bold move to kill her off, and the story's so much better for it. I really applaud the development team for this. But before all this happens, let's talk about some of the events of the story that leads up to this point and what happens after. In the very beginning of the game, while you're still in Midgard, Shinra and the Shinra president are kind of posed as the main villains of the game. So as you're going to the capital of Midgard, after getting captured by the president and his team, it starts to look pretty bleak for Cloud and the crew. However, you're mysteriously released and you see a bunch of guards and Shinra employees that have just been slaughtered. Come to find out, Sephiroth is the one that did all this. And then finally, when you make it to the president's quarters, you find that Sephiroth killed the president, which I also find to be very bold, because at this point, Sephiroth really is only ever a talking point. We haven't really seen him in the game yet. I had no idea this was going to happen at all, and it was super cool, and I was blown away by it. And again, it also displays how weak the team is at the moment for getting captured by Shinra in the first place, and then how strong Sephiroth is for wiping out Shinra. This was the first real great twist for me, and this is kind of the moment where I really got invested into the story and was genuinely curious to see where it goes, even though I knew some pivotal future events. The next notable moment is probably Barrett's backstory. For Barrett's backstory, he returns to his hometown and he has to confront one of his old friends, and these events allow further insight into Barrett's character and kind of justifies his personality somewhat. And it kind of leads to a resolution for him with him dealing with his past. Again, another bold way where you find out that Barrett's daughter Marlene is actually his friend's daughter that he's been taking care of because he thought that his friend, Dine, who's the biological father of Marlene, was dead this whole time. But then once you find out he's alive and that he's kind of been doing some evil stuff because he's tormented about his wife's death and the thought of his daughter Marlene being dead as well. So naturally you have to confront him. Dine's been taking out his anger and hatred on anyone and everyone in the area. However, once Barrett finds him and informs him that Marlene's still alive, he comes to the realization that he can't really live with himself. So he decides to stop living. Again, super bold choice, really dark, and I think it adds a lot to the story. I really enjoyed this section. Another one of the twists that I didn't know about was the Kate Sith twist, and I think they did it really well. It is somewhat expertly foreshadowed prior to it actually happening, but it kind of went over my head and I didn't see it coming at all, especially because Kate Sith definitely seemed like an unlikely candidate for being the spy / traitor of the group because of how uninvested the story seemed to be within this character, and that's kind of where that expert foreshadowing comes in. And then once he betrays the team, you find out that he's an employee of Shinra and he's actually remotely controlling the character that you're seeing, which I think adds a lot to his character and is really pretty cool. If Kate Sith would have been a regular party member that made like some type of side deal with Shinra and then came to regret it later and then switched sides back to Cloud's team, I think that would have been way too safe and pretty lame to say the least. However, with Kate Sith being a Shinra employee the entire time, it does make a whole lot of sense why he would be the spy, and based off his character design as well, kind of makes sense that it's essentially an animatron. And on top of all this, he also hadn't been with the team that long, so he basically had to betray him or he wouldn't be able to help later on with him, which we'll talk about here in a second. So in a way, his hand was kind of forced, and he basically explains this later on. He does, however, quickly redeem himself a couple times actually, and with the first time being almost immediately after doing this. And that of course is where he leads the team to the Temple of the Ancients, and he helps them acquire the Black Materia. To obtain the Black Materia requires the sacrifice of one of the team members. So again, with Kate Sith being remotely controlled, this obviously makes him the most advantageous party member for the situation. And this act puts faith back into the character and almost immediately redeems him, even if the team doesn't immediately trust him again. And then later on, he saves the team again after they've been captured by bringing in the airship, and he further redeems himself. I think this is great character writing and great story writing. Speaking of good writing, pretty much everyone's backstory and character development is all implemented very well, especially for the characters that have their story integrated into the main story, like Tifa, Aerith, Cloud, Sid, Kate Sith, and of course Sephiroth. Again, I already knew a lot about Cloud and Sephiroth's backstory and plot points throughout the game due to it pretty much being all over the internet, but I didn't really know how deep it actually went. I was pleasantly surprised by how interesting this narrative gets. Most of the story around Sephiroth is extremely interconnected with the world and lore, with how the Sephiroth that we're seeing is actually a clone of the real Sephiroth, and how both Cloud and Sephiroth are tied to Genova, who's essentially a god at this point. And I really like how Sephiroth was basically using Cloud the entire time, and essentially letting Cloud believe that it was his hatred for Sephiroth that was pushing Cloud to find him, when in reality it was actually Sephiroth summoning Cloud to him. Sephiroth only let Cloud believe that his hatred for him was pulling him towards him, which again establishes Sephiroth as even more of a monstrous entity at this point in the game, which I think is the markings of a great villain. The reveal of what actually has been happening the entire time with Cloud and Sephiroth and how everyone else in the party handles it, I think is just wonderful, especially with Tifa. The singular standout moment that makes Tifa best girl is when she has to restore Cloud's mind and sticks with him by his side until the very end. This whole section, although it's essentially just an exposition dump, is magnificent. Everyone else in the party seemingly gives up on Cloud for a multitude of reasons, but primarily for giving Sephiroth the Black Materia. But Tifa never does. In fact, she's distraught after losing Cloud, and even though the world might be ending very soon, and the Cloud that she knows is possibly not the real Cloud, all she wants is for him to return and to be by his side. This is like the epitome of an excellent feminine character, and almost a perfect love interest. And then when you find Cloud after he's basically become a vegetable from too much Mako exposure, all Tifa wants to do is stay with him, even though she knows that Sephiroth has to be stopped, or the planet's gonna die along with everyone else in it. She's a definition of a ride or die. And or she has immovable faith that Cloud will come back to her and defeat Sephiroth and save the world. Either way, again, this is wonderful character writing, and that's why she's best girl. As previously mentioned, I really like Yuffie's side quest and how it all turns out, but I think what I like even more is the alternate option of dealing with the final encounter with the Turks, and you only get this option after completing Yuffie's side quest. Towards one of the final sections of the game, when you have to go back to Midgar, you encounter the Turks for one last time. If you've completed Yuffie's side quest, where you and the Turks have to team up in order to save one of their members and Yuffie, you get the option at this final encounter with them to simply just agree to disagree and go your separate ways. And you bet I absolutely did this, and I love that my story turned out like this with the Turks. Throughout the story, you run into this group several times, and of course you have to face them in battle. And they're essentially like a mercenary group that's been hired by or is loyal to Shinra or something like that, but they don't really come off as bad guys. They're more like like anti-heroes in a sense. So with this alternate option unlocked at this final encounter with them, you can choose to make peace with them, or you can vilify them, which I feel like that's what this game's been setting up this whole time. Who they are is really who you see them as. So I really like this addition. Also, the reveal of who Cloud really is crazy. Sephiroth reveals the truth, quote unquote, to Cloud that he's not the real Cloud, and in fact he's a failed clone of Sephiroth. That's why he can be summoned by Sephiroth. From this, Cloud stands firm on his belief that Sephiroth is lying to him. However, it's the uncertainty of Tifa and the information that she's withholding that she now chooses to reveal to Cloud that makes him basically give up on himself and give himself over to Sephiroth. Sephiroth and Tifa basically explain the events of Cloud's hometown where everyone's slaughtered and the town burns down because of Sephiroth, that the memories of what Cloud has of that can't be real because he wasn't there. Sephiroth explains that his memories are those of another character named Zack, who took Cloud's place as the first class soldier member, and Zack was the one that accompanied Sephiroth during that mission, and Tifa basically concurs with this. And on top of this, there's a lot of hints that harken back to Cloud not actually being there for that night, and that this other guy, Zack, was there, some of which Tifa explains that she's been hiding from him the whole time. And again, various NPCs don't remember Cloud being there, and nobody throughout the game remembers Cloud being part of Soldier. So now that Cloud thinks that he's a failed clone of Sephiroth, and that most of his memories are a lie, and Sephiroth has ultimate control over him, he basically just gives up and lets Sephiroth do just that, take control of him. And then the events with Tifa and him falling into the live stream and being exposed to too much Mako happen, but this really isn't the truth of Cloud's origins either. So now we're on a twist of another twist. This Cloud that we're playing as is the one and only Cloud. He's not a clone of Sephiroth, he's indeed Cloud Strife. However, he is to some extent an experiment of Hojo's, and has some of Jenova's cells with him, just like the Sephiroth clones. Therefore, because of this, Sephiroth can control and manipulate Cloud, but only to an extent. So the various different times that Cloud has fought off Sephiroth after being controlled by him is specifically because he's not a clone of Sephiroth, but they are linked through Jenova cells. So what really happened with Cloud was that he never made it into Soldier. He only made it into the army and couldn't move up into Soldier. He was born in Nibelheim, and his mother was slaughtered by Sephiroth that night, and the whole town was burned down. And Cloud was there, but he wasn't the soldier member accompanying Sephiroth. He was one of the army soldiers alongside Zack, who also happened to be one of his good friends. Cloud hid his face because he was embarrassed to return home because he hadn't made it into Soldier, and specifically, he didn't want Tifa to see him. However, when Cloud sees what Sephiroth has done and how he killed his mother, burned down the town, hurt Tifa and Zack, Cloud becomes enraged, picks up the Buster Sword, which initially was Zack's weapon, and then uses the Buster Sword to run Sephiroth through. This injures Sephiroth immensely, but it doesn't kill him. Sephiroth then takes off with the head of Jenova. Cloud then tracks him down, trying to kill him due to Zack's seemingly last command to kill Sephiroth, but Cloud's not strong enough to kill Sephiroth, and Sephiroth runs Cloud through with his sword. However, still enraged by his loss, Cloud musters up the strength to lift Sephiroth up from the sword that's sticking in him and throw Sephiroth off the cliff and into the life stream, thus returning him to the planet, which is what happened when you die. So thus this kills the real Sephiroth, but that's also not true either. But really he just joins the planet and stays within that part of the planet until of course you reach him at the very end of the game. After all this happens, Hojo inspects the incident and recovers any remaining bodies from the scene so that he can either experiment on them or attempt to create a new Sephiroth clone from them. So Cloud and Zack get put into incubation chambers in order to keep them alive along with him for further future experimenting. Both are initially unconscious. However, Zack, kind of being the elite soldier, wakes up, escapes from the incubation, and frees Cloud, who again is his comrade but also his friend. They basically go into hiding for a year, and Cloud deals with the psychosis of being exposed to too much Mako, which is similar to how he is after Tifa finds him after he's fallen into the life stream. And throughout this year, Zack basically takes care of him. They have an unfortunate run-in with the Shinra team that's been hunting him since they've escaped, and during this run-in, Zack gets fatally shot and dies. With Cloud essentially being helpless in his psychosis, the Shinra team just leaves him in the middle of nowhere to die. However, Cloud comes to enough to get out of the area where he surely would have died at, and he takes Zack's Buster Sword and ends up making it to the 7th sector in Midgar, where Tifa finds him. After she finds him and kind of nurses him somewhat, he breaks out of the psychosis, partially. He now functions fine, but some of his memories are foggy, and he takes on a lot of Zack's memories as his own. That's why when he remembers the Niflheim incident, he sees it through Zack's point of view. So, Sephiroth was bending the truth and using the connection between him and Cloud through Jenova to manipulate him. And Cloud was using the history of Zack, making it into Soldier as his own history. So this does explain why people don't remember Cloud being in Soldier, and people from Nibelheim not remembering him being there either, because all the people that would have been there while he was there are now dead. This quadruple twist was insane, but it was really cool and executed very well. But speaking of insane, along with this in a sense, Hojo's development is also wild. I did not see him being Sephiroth's father at all. And although there were a lot of hints when you look back, I didn't really see it coming because they did a really great job of pushing this character to the background of the story. And although some of the hints were in plain sight, I really didn't read much into them because of the seemingly unimportance of his character. It very much seemed like Hojo was just going to be this mad scientist guy that works for Shinra and constructs a lot of the advanced equipment that they have and weapons, etc. And of course, course, we knew he was the creator of the clones of Sephiroth. However, being the original father was wild. But it does make a lot of sense, and I like this. And the boss fight was super epic and a ton of fun. Speaking of epic, the final boss fight with Jenova and Sephiroth are awesome. Jenova isn't really as much of a challenge as Sephiroth is, but it's still a pretty cool spectacle. The Sephiroth fight, on the other hand, is bombastic in the best of ways. I love the presentation of the Sephiroth fight. How he's almost a god at this point, and there's such an ethereal appearance to him. And he has that one big epic attack that takes like 5 minutes. And during the whole fight, the epic track of One Wing Angel plays, which is the only time in the game where that track plays. And the fact that he's pretty tough too, really no matter when you go into it, because of the certain moves that he has and how everything works out. And it's just a wonderful fight. I went into it pretty overpowered, and I still struggled. Super great final fight. But of course, after you beat him as the one-winged angel, Cloud has one more encounter with him, but it's in his mind. Cloud faces off against the hold that Sephiroth has on him through their connection through Jenova in his mind. This is shown as a direct one-to-one face-off between the two characters in a battle sequence in a pitch-black area where only the two characters are visible. This sets up and seems like a regular battle, but essentially it's kind of like a quick action time event. But anyway, Cloud then uses his ultimate limit break, which is Omni Slash, which is a super cool limit break that ends up taking down Sephiroth one last time and purges the last remaining bit of Sephiroth from Cloud. After Sephiroth is returned to the planet, the meteor spell that's been summoned a while back is still plummeting towards Midgar, with the plan to wipe out the Earth and take everyone there to the Promised Land. I don't think I've mentioned this up till now, but this was the master plan of Sephiroth, to summon the spell meteor, which would destroy the planet and open a pathway to the Promised Land for Sephiroth, and some of the other ancients and potentially everybody on Earth. The Promised Land essentially being like heaven. As the meteor is heading down and getting closer and closer to the Earth, the spell Holy kicks off, which comes from a materia that Aerith had the whole time, and was the main reason why Sephiroth killed her, because he knew that the spell Holy would potentially stop Meteor. But now at this point, right before Meteor crashes into Midgar, Holy is used to stop it, but it's not enough. It's almost halted at this point, but it's slowly making its way towards Midgar. But then there's a faint glow of green color that appears, which the color is significant because this is Aerith's color when she's performing various different spells. And it's also the color of the life stream, which is a collection of everybody's souls essentially. It then starts to grow and make its way towards Meteor, and it gets larger and larger, and more areas of the world start to have this glow emitted from it. The stream of this essence then eventually makes its way to Meteor and helps to spell Holy to push the meteor back and potentially destroy it. This continues to go on until essentially the whole planet's covered by this glow. You have the build-up of the sense that this is going to stop the meteor, and then as the whole planet's engulfed by the green glow, the game ends and the credits start rolling. But at the end of the credits, there's a scene with a fully grown Red 13 running through an area of the planet with two other creatures of his kind, and they run up to Midgar. However, now Midgar is fully engulfed with greenery, insinuating that meteor was stopped thanks to the spell Holy and Aerith's life stream. And now that Mako's not being extracted from the planet anymore, the planet as a whole is healthy again, and this allows for growth over Midgar. And then the original Final Fantasy VII properly ends. The ending here is a little bit vague, but I do think it's really good. It's also really predictable, but I think it's a really good resolution for all the things that had been building up to this point, and it's a really good resolution and outcome for all the characters in the game, so I like that. Conclusion. The original Final Fantasy VII is definitely an old game at this point, with a weird art design, poor graphics at times, and some cumbersome travel sections, along with some annoying minigames. However, this game is often remarked as one of the best Final Fantasy games of all time, because of how great the battle system, the materia system, how superb the story and character writing are, how magnificent the ensemble of the party members are, how great the villains are, and how great the open world is. I truly came to enjoy every significant character, and I think this is the best cast of any Final Fantasy title. The story had its hooks in me from the beginning, and its scripts just tightened as the game went on. I was thoroughly impressed with the depth of the lore and the twist on top of twists on top of twists, along with various developments of characters throughout the story, which were almost perfect with a vast majority of them. Even though there's very few animations in this game when compared to modern titles, and there's no voice acting here, I really felt the majority of the big moments, and I thought they were all meaningful and impactful, with a lot of the scenes that'll stay with me as I journey on to play more Final Fantasy titles. The battle system is one of the best battle systems in any turn-based JRPG, and definitely one of the best battle systems in Final Fantasy history. The materia system is so simple in concept, but so brilliantly executed, and offers a ton of customization while still being pungently focused. The summon system is also one of the best iterations of the Final Fantasy summon system in the entire franchise, and there's so many summons here, and they all offer something unique to the battle system. The music is also outstanding. There's a fairly wide variety of tracks that fit all the situations that they're in or the area that you're in at that particular time, and there's some of the singular best tracks in the entire franchise here in the original Final Fantasy VII. Although this game is dated to an extent, the original Final Fantasy VII is absolutely worth playing in 2024, and is still one of the best Final Fantasy games of all time, if not the best. If you liked the video and you want to see more like this, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and hit the bell notification. That way you don't miss out on any future videos. And leave a comment and tell me what you thought about the video or what you'd like to see me do next. I'm playing through Final Fantasy VII Remake now, with plans to play Final Fantasy VII Rebirth after that. So if you want to see videos on those games, just let me know. Again, thank you for all the support. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I love seeing what you think about the video and your opinions on the game in the comments. Also, if you want to help support the channel further, consider becoming a member and get some extra loyalty badges, emojis for comments, and a shout out in my next video. But until then, I wish you all the very best and hope you enjoyed. Bye bye!